large and wonderfully distinguished and wonderfully international audience, as is fitting to hear Joan Taylor. Thank you all for coming, if that's the right word for what you're doing. And thank you particularly to our speaker, Joan Taylor. I trust you all appreciate she is going to be speaking to us from Wellington, New Zealand, where it is precisely 7:20 in the morning, and this for her probably precedes a full teaching day where she will be teaching undergraduates in London. Is that correct?
Not this
Roughly.
morning, but later on tonight.
Yeah. So in any case, a lot of zigzagging around the ether. It's a huge pleasure, but incredibly difficult to introduce Joan because she is a person of so many parts and talents and accomplishments, and having known her and enjoyed her as a colleague and friend for a very long time, it's all the harder to pick out from everything that she's done. But essentially, as her bio, her King's bio says, she's a historian who teaches in early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. She has been at King's College London, where she's since 2009, I believe, where she's Professor of Christian Origins and Second Temple Judaism. But she also has had a very high profile in, as they say, public engagement. And you may well have seen on television and so on. Her training is has began in New Zealand, continued with doctoral work in Oxford, but also a very formative period in Jerusalem of the British School of Archaeology, now the Kenyon Institute. Her books are numerous, as are her other writings, but I'd like to pick out in particular, in 2018, What Did Jesus Look Like? I just love the title, and it's not at all as frivolous as it might sound. Just last year, she brought out a very learned commentary, long awaited, of one of the volumes of Philo of Alexandria in the Distinguished Commentary series. That's the one on the contemplative life, so that's a translation as well. Before that, a book now in it revised of on the Essenes, the Scrolls, and the Dead Sea. And I've always particularly enjoyed her book on the women among the Therapeutae in of Alexandria. But there is plenty more. Most memorable, perhaps, a completely unique conference that Joan masterminded and held on the Jesus and Brian. You can all guess what that's about. The Monty Python's Life of Brian, a triumphal event which resulted in a book exploring the historical Jesus and his time via Monty Python's Life of Brian. And at least one of the team was there on hand. It was a most remarkable event. I could say plenty more about Joan. We're delighted that she's talking about Babatha's sisters today. She would have been in Israel at around this time or a little later, researching her current project on the topic. And this is a beautiful sequel to a fine lecture by Charlotte Hempel that we had. Many of you were there late last year, I suppose, since this year hasn't been going for very long. So Joan, without more ado, I welcome you to talk on Babatha sisters, Judean women refugees in the wilderness caves.
Well, thank you very much, Tessa. That's a great honour to have you introducing me like that, and I feel embarrassed by your words, but thank you so much. And let me just also thank everyone in the Anglo-Israel Archaeological Society for inviting me, Anthony for all his technical help, and Sheila for her wonderful administration of the event. And thank you all for coming along and tuning in to this lecture. So what I'm going to do now is share my screen. Hopefully, Anthony, this is all going to work brilliantly. So I'm just going to press the button. Here we are. Can everyone see? Is all working? Okay, fantastic.
Yes,
we have your whole screen though, Joan. Is that what you want with?
Yes, I'm trying to press from the beginning. Ah, here we go.
Perfect, perfect.
Here we are. Here we are. I'm going to read out my lecture. I wouldn't normally do this in a public lecture, but I find that actually in presenting anything on Zoom, it's much more difficult to be fluent and to time. So I'm going to read out. So bear with me as I read out my paper, which I would normally otherwise do only in an academic conference. So just to begin, to recap on the beginning of the explorations of the wilderness caves from the Bar Kokhba period, these began in the 1950s with the Bedouin discoveries in the Nahal Heva, Nahal Sealim and Murabat and so on, west of the Dead Sea, after which archaeologists undertook urgent expeditions and explorations before any further materials were looted. In 1960 to 1961, after some previous expeditions to the area of the Nahal Heva, south of En Gedi beside the Dead Sea, had indicated there could be important remains and caves in this wadi, Yigal Yadin directed excavations of a large cave with two openings, some 100 meters below a Roman siege camp in the Nahal Heva. The incredible inaccessibility of the cave, high in the middle of the rocky escarpment of the wadi, far from any water sources, involving a hair-raising journey along a narrow path with a sheer drop and then an ascent up a high ladder, was noted by the researchers. Here, shortly after, they found a small fragment of the psalm scroll in the front hall of the cave. The team discovered in a tiny crevice at the very back of the cave in Hall C, a water skin that contained a bundle of papyri, 15 letters, 10 in Hebrew, 3 in Aramaic, and 2 in Greek, and thus Yadin dubbed the Cave of Letters. These letters on papyrus and one on wood were amazingly from the leader of the second Judean revolt against Rome in the years 132 to 135 CE. His name was actually Shimon Bar Kokhba, and his letters were addressed to rebel commanders in nearby En Gedi, Yohanatan ben Ba'yan and Mazabala, son of Shimon. This provided an immediate impression to Yadin that this cave was where Yohanatan himself took refuge with his family when the Romans came to quash the revolt, and this stamped the cave with its overarching significance. For Yadin and future researchers, change the slide. For Yadin and future researchers, this cave and many others like it in the Judean wilderness would be primarily important for what light they would shed on the Bar Kokhba revolt. Little attested in literature and without a Josephus, the details of what took place were only sketchily known, even though it was understood to have had hugely significant consequences for Judeans and indeed all Jews. Yadin's popular book, providing details of his excavations, would accordingly be titled Bar Kokhba, the rediscovery of the legendary hero of the last Jewish revolt against Imperial Rome. As the decades have rolled on and more caves with artifacts from this time have been discovered, the fundamental paradigm for their significance has been in their relevance for the Bar Kokhba revolt. Clearly, the archaeology has provided magnificent data that illuminate texts about this time. Indeed, I highly recommend the recent publication by Hanan Eshel and Boaz Zissou, who together present the most comprehensive and up-to-date examination of everything the caves can tell us about this momentous period of history. Many more caves have been discovered, and they provide extraordinary finds as a resource for understanding. I do not want to question this paradigm for the primary significance of the caves, though one should remember also that these caves have yielded rich materials from the Chalcolithic, Iron Age, and other periods. But already, Yadin found in the cave material that points us in the direction of another paradigm of interpretation, as many researchers have noted. This paradigm concerns the story of Judean women, not only as they were caught up in the last days of the revolt and its aftermath, but as they were before this time. This was in fact clear to Yadin himself from the finds of 1961, when in another goatskin bag found in a crevice, a bundle of letters came to light in cloth tied up with string. This is, of course, the Babatha archive, 35 documents spanning the years 97 to 132 CE, with sales, loans, deposits, gifts, marriage contracts, a host of legal texts that greatly illuminate a woman's life before the revolt. This is the world of Babatha and her family in Mahosa, a Judean village across from En Gedi on the east side of the Dead Sea. Since this discovery, another woman's archive has been defined from materials that were purchased from Bedouin, that is Salome Komaezi. Both archives have provided enormous insights into law and life in the periods between the two revolts. Many very important studies have been done by eminent scholars like Hannah Cotton, Tala Lan, Jacqueline Udshorn. Recently, Kimberly Jakowski has again examined the subject of law in detail. I recommend for a general audience also the recent book by ex-lawyer Philip Esler, Babatha's Orchard, that really brings all this world of Babatha and her legal cases to light. This work on the women's archives and other documentary papyri of the Judean caves takes us into women's world in a way that our historical literature simply does not, and its value is outstanding. However, both these paradigms of interpretation point outside the caves to periods of history either during or before anyone arrived in them. My own particular interests at the moment are much more narrow. One of the things that has yet to be explored fully, I think, is the experience of people in the caves as refugees. While the contents of the text tell us important things, in my work I go back to the caves to think about the text as artifacts and accompaniments to the people actually there. I ask, what was the experience of the refugees in both the Cave of Letters and other caves of the Judean wilderness? And led by the artifacts themselves, I focus in particular on the women refugees. This is done with an acute awareness that in our own time, people are experiencing much the same kind of displacement. People in Syria invaded by ISIS, and then Kurds in territory bordering Turkey, all have fled to caves at different times in the past decade. Their experience of the present day can be used to reflect on the experience of the people who left their belongings in the caves long ago. I engage with their stories today, as well as reflect on the historical and archaeological data. I hope that this kind of work can complement the important studies done on reading and understanding the text and the primary focus of the Bar Kokhba fighters. My approach also falls within the field of what is called engendered archaeology, whereby there is a special interest in defining how objects are related to gendered space, for example, or how they might be used in the lives of men and women. But this study primarily is of refugee archaeology, in having an a priori recognition that we're dealing with artifacts that have been displaced from their usual living environment because the people who own and use these artifacts have themselves been displaced. In this talk, I'm going to begin with the published material on the Cave of Letters, but I also am going to be in conversation with another cave that will be more unfamiliar to you. I will be introducing you to some unpublished archival photographs of the British excavations of the so-called Christmas Cave, done under the auspices of the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, a former independent British organisation led by John Allegro, which undertook expeditions and excavations in 2 caves in the Wadi an-Nar, or Lower Nahal Kidron, under license from the Department of Antiquities of Jordan and with direct support from the Hashemite royal family. These caves were originally named N1 and N2, and the team worked over seasons in the winters of 1961 through to 1963. N1 was found and preliminarily investigated by John Allegro and Howard Stutchbury at the end of 1960, following the revelation of its whereabouts by Bedouin. The Bedouin finds from the cave were purchased by the fund, and we will return to these in a moment. The cave was named the Christmas Cave following the first season after a visit from King Hussein of Jordan by helicopter on Boxing Day, actually, in December 1961. Though in fact, according to his notebook from this excavation, Allegro himself missed this momentous visit. The excavations have actually never been scientifically published. In his book, Search in the Desert, Allegro presents an alternative history version of the events, but in his personal archive, which allows for accuracy, we can see the whole events as they unfold. Many a subsequent researcher, basing themselves on the popular book, has reported it as actually more factual than indeed it was, and I take the opportunity to clarify the circumstances. I'm very grateful to John Allegro's daughter, Judith Brown, for allowing me to work with this important archive, for transcribing Allegro's notebook from the first season, and for letting me scan these images. And I'm currently working on a book, bringing all the surviving archival sources on these excavations to publication. So now, I want to ask why this conversation between caves excavated around the same time, what the artifacts themselves tell us. How can we read an assemblage forensically to discover what people experienced in a cave? As a framework to govern my thinking in terms of a displacement vocation, I use the concept of a woman's bag. I think all of us women know our bags. Today, we can recognize the kind of bag a woman likes to have and the kind of bag suitable for a man. We consider them as an accessory to our look. We know when they are messy or tidy, and we can store a lot of things in our bags. But what makes a woman's bag rather than a man's bag in the 2nd century? There were a number of bags in the Cave of Letters, and others have been found elsewhere. But how do we read these in terms of gender and the refugee experience? Fortunately, one of the great things Yadin did meticulously, even in a book designed for the general public and in the early days of Israeli archaeology, was to tell his readers about the archaeological context of the finds, which allows consideration of the use of space, for example. Let's go back to the initial discovery in Bar Kokhba back of the cave. The goatskin bag in the crevice was identified as having an original use as a water skin. And this in itself is a rare find, since organic items like this do not usually survive. A water container of any kind would normally be associated with a woman, because it was woman's work to fetch and carry water, as it is in many parts of the world today. This has been patched and was possibly not doing its job as well, hence its redeployment. It was no longer used as a water skin, but as a container of other items. In terms of the experience of refugees, I think of having to quickly assemble things from home you need to carry some distance. Usually people would not have a great many bags on hand for packing. What would you grab? Nothing too big, because the cave access meant not only meant not using a donkey, but carrying it yourself and leaving children. This bag represents someone's choice and a choice about not only what might be useful for the refuge cave, but also what might be preserved if the Romans then came and torched your home. So what were these items chosen for use and preservation? Yadin, in his Bar Kokhba book, lists balls of dyed wool, a baby's tunic, a bundle of unspun wool, rags, pieces of cloth, a cylindrical wooden container, a silver pot earring, beads of semi-precious stones, a bone handle, a spoon head, an ornate bone handle, and a glass vial, presumably for perfumed oil. Yadin lists more items in the official publication of the cave as spindle wools, they're illustrated, and a leather purse. Beside the water skin, which had been torn open, was a mirror, and according to Yadin also, inside the skin and nearby, the remains of another much rotted skin were found. On the floor of the crevice were small beads and a seal impression, and also some finds of this crevice may be associated with the second rotten bag, so it's difficult to know where Yadin would have placed, for example, a key, a knife, a stopper, a scarf, and a sash. We learned that the wooden box of pyxis contained rouge powder. A woman's bag, no doubt, stated Yadin. He asked then what made the woman bother to hide this stuff in the most remote end of the cave, implying that collectively it was not of great value, even the silver earring. It was the papyri that made it important to Yadin. The fact that it was found in a woman's bag probably meant that the documents were very precious to the woman, he said. When Yadin understood the letters, he wrote, the goat skin with the batch of letters were probably belonged to the wife of Jehonatan, son of Babatha, who, when she fled with the others to the cave, took with her, in addition to the family belongings, part of the personal archive of Jehonatan. Yet for Yadin, the wife of Jehonatan put them in a water-skin container to hide them in a crevice at the back of the cave because of the letters. These were the most important artifacts. However, I would firstly like to ask whether a woman would necessarily assume that these letters were the most important items in her bag. If it were me, I would save the silver earring, even though I had lost its pair. I would save lovely coloured balls of wool if they were dyed with expensive dyes and perfume, or other artifacts that were special to me, perhaps even for sentimental reasons. Overall, these are not so much family items, but personal items belonging to a woman, including what I would call her bath bag stuff, cosmetics, perfume, a mirror. She's concerned to look decent in a cave environment, and she is going to do her spinning. The fact that there is little wool left unspun may well indicate the time she spent in the cave, enough time to spin those balls. Note that as a way of wrapping up unspun wool, a piece of an old mantle has been used. What would make me save letters belonging to male members of my household? Sheer love, nostalgia even, something addressed to my husband, father, brother, or son from the eminent Prince of Israel would indeed be considered important. But whether they would be the only precious items to me, I'm not so sure. It is very unlikely that this woman would have read the letters herself, that she would have associated their reading with her menfolk and with their purpose. That the bag also included rags, pieces of cloth, cosmetics, and a mirror indicates that it was a working bag for this woman, not just one packed up for hiding with family effects, and that the precious items were among those taken to save from her home in En-Gedi. The rags for menstruation, patching, or nappies were extremely useful, and the pieces of cloth, as we have seen here, were used for wrapping. To me, it seems that she was a relative of both men, with access to both sets of personal letters, and she had taken them with her. And it seems to me quite risky. To take them with her would have identified her as a relative of insurgents, and for anyone who had the ability to read them. Inside her working bag, what she had taken with her to the cave then indicates her desperate attempts to save not only the letters, but all she considered of value and use, and all that were part of herself, her identity, including the baby tunic, which implies indeed she had a baby. With the Roman camp built above this cave, and perhaps then hearing the Romans on their way, she hid everything personal to her in the deepest recess. In her capture or death, the Romans at least would not have as booty that earring or that perfume. To me, that is a kind of victory in the face of utter defeat. The archive belonging to Babatha was also found in a goatskin bag, which was probably made out of multiple bags, likely also repurposed water skins. It was found placed in a crevice under a stone, not so far along Halsey, on top of which was a basketry bag, hidden then at the same time. Let's look first at this basketry bag. Inside it was a painted wooden jewellery box, 3 wooden plates, a wooden bowl and an iron sickle and a wooden handle, a spare pair of woman's sandals, indicating from the wear that the woman had a limp, 3 keys, 2 of which were key rings, a group of iron knives, useful for cooking, frying pan, 2 bronze jugs, a mirror. These are homeless homewares that could still be useful for cooking, serving food, for undertaking other women's work, even cutting wood or gathering fruit. That the keys are in a woman's bag indicates her sense of ownership over the home, but it's also incredibly touching as a sign of hope. You take a key, even if you fear your house will be burnt down. You take a key in the hope it maybe will remain, that the house will remain unscathed for you to go home. The key, in a sense, is home. Many refugee families, even today, treasure the keys to homes that have long gone. As for the goatskin bag, this was quite worm and rat eaten when discovered. There were fragments of skins inside, which indicate the bag was formed out of multiple water skins again. There was a clasp knife, balls of linen, yarn, and pieces of linen, fabric, rags, sacks, and strings. Everything, says Yadin, that a woman would need for mending her family's clothes. Though, as before, a woman would also use cloth for multiple reasons, and the skeins of spun linen would suggest that she was also intending to make garments. Having spun all this linen thread, it would be a valuable item, ready for use, that no woman would want to lose. Elsewhere in the cave, Yadin's found spindle, wool, skeins, balls of wool, including unspun wool, the standard assemblage of items necessary for spinning. Garments were highly valued, and making them was slow work. As with other women's bags then, there were also important documents. These documents include those in which Babatha is directly mentioned, but also include documents relating to male members of the household. We see here women's bags could be made of goatskin or basketry and contain other receptacles in the form of leather purses or cosmetic and jewelry boxes. Women's bags could contain items associated with personal care, but also concerned with women's work, and they could have materials associated with male members of the household, like letters or contracts, and have items that were gender neutral, for example, keys. Such archives, while originally belonging to these male members of the household, had passed to them and were therefore their archives. These documents were valuable to them in multiple ways in terms of ownership of property and status, though some of these could also have been preserved by women simply because they were writings associated with their menfolk. There is, of course, another use of the basketry bag, bags in the Cave of Letters that I want to mention before moving on from this cave. And that is the grim collection of skeletal remains that we also found in Hall C, indicated by that arrow. The congealed fragments of the occupants' own clothing was found together with their skeletal remains. These were found in one area in what Yadin describes as the burial niche in Hall C. Beautiful striped rugs were later extracted from this area, blankets that were used to cover the dead. So it's likely that someone came later on to pack the bodies away. There can't have been very many visitors to this cave given the extreme extremely difficult access to it. However, there was already one burial in the niche. In general, there was little indication of trauma to the skeletons, and thus it is possible that these people died of dehydration and starvation. However, there was some indication on skulls 2 and 17 that they had been traumatized hit. A woman in her 20s, and the second was a child aged 7. The skeletons themselves indicate that the remaining occupants of this cave were largely women, youths, and children. There were 7 women, 6 children aged 10 or under, 1 girl aged 15, 1 boy aged 14 to 15, and 2 men, one aged about 40 and the other 25. There was also a burial area actually used by the occupants, Locus 3, where various bones and textiles were found. Previously, in excavations by Aharoni and Rothenberg, human bones were found just near the far end of Hall C, very close to where the goatskin bag containing the Bar Kokhba letters was situated. The skeletons were associated with the clothing they would have died in, and we therefore have full outfits for men, women, and children, along with their remains, as well as these rugs and mats. These rugs themselves, thinking about the refugees, point to the use in the Bar Kokhba caves in the same way as we remember from this image of the Kurdish refugees. A mat spread on the ground made a cave into a kind of home, keeping the dust away. Mats and blankets became the bedding of these people and also became their shrouds. It is with all this in mind that I would like to move now about 40 kilometers north from the Nahal Hever to the Nahal Kidron and consider what kind of situation we might have in the Christmas cave. Unlike with Yadin's meticulous recording of information and documentation, the data that survives and is accessible from the SIG is quite patchy, and I'm very indebted also to the team from the Israel Cave Research Center, Roy Porat, Hanan Eshel, Amos Frumkin, and also to Uri Davidovich, who have prepared a map when they refound it in 2007 and undertook some salvage soundings, because the original map has actually gone missing. In Allegro's notebook from the first season, there's no schematic drawing, but he did record the dimensions of the cave by separating it out into 2 parts, a cave and a tunnel. And I put on this slide how I can match Allegro's record of the dimensions to the map that is recorded from the Israel Cave Research Center. The overall dimensions were 60 meters from one entrance to another. Details of the excavation can be reconstructed from the archive, which comprises, as I said, documentary materials such as a notebook, also letters, photographic dossier, not only with Judith Brown in terms of the personal archive, but also a large collection of negatives that are in the University of Manchester that have been gifted to the keeping of the University of Manchester. Also a report made by Russell Adams for Philip Davies, very usefully in 1996, funded by the British Academy, and Russell Adams has kindly shared this with me. I'm also grateful to Orit Shamir and Nama Sukenik of the Israel Organic Materials Unit of the Israel Antiquities Authority, who have charge now of the organic remains from the cave. There's a whole story of the actual cave and the artifacts and how they exist, split up partly in the Rockefeller stalls and partly in the IAA. And I better not go on that track for the moment because it's a big story. At any rate, I'd like to share some of the archival images from the Christmas cave to think about the refugee circumstances of this cave. And I'd like to begin with a slide entitled in the Allegro series, Bone, Linen and Rope from N1. This assemblage in N1, the Christmas cave, was discovered in the first season of excavations prior to the renaming of the cave. And you will see here a blue towel which lay outside and was used as a backdrop for a number of photographs of artifacts taken by Allegro as things emerged. What this photograph seems to show is the same kind of water skin we have already encountered in Nahal Hever, in which there are 2 layers of skin, and within it protrudes a white bone. The goat skin itself is wrapped in strong braided rope, which would be appropriate for it being carried perhaps with other items. It was contained additionally in a piece of basketry, not fashioned nicely into a proper bag, but really just an extra wrap around the water skin. The colour slide has no scale, and you might imagine it as quite large, but a black and white image from the Manchester collection shows it was quite small because there is a hand usefully providing scale. Here one can see that the basketry in that black and white photograph has been detached. Allegro's identification of linen seems to apply to some fragments seen on the right side of the photograph, so that there were different layers of containment: basketry, mat, linen, double-lined water skins. In terms of this object, it is a working bag, but an example of how skins were used prior to being repurposed as a container for other objects in Nahal Hever. The appearance of the bone, which is probably sheep goat, though I'm actually eager for a better definition, rests quite lightly inside the water skin and may possibly be intrusive because quite a number of bones have been found in the cave. And there is a possibility they are remains of much later meals eaten by shepherds who then buried the remains. So if we put the bone on one side, is this another woman's bag? I would indeed say so, since it is a woman's work to fetch water. In the case of those who had occupied the Christmas cave, water could be fetched from the Kidron torrent below. In addition, there are photographs showing textiles as they were discovered. Some were found in wads, which are in some ways similar to the congealed textiles mixed up with the human bones and the baskets of the Cave of Letters. However, this one has more distinguishable layers, as if it has been folded up. But it is not just one textile. It is a multiple collection of textiles that are dyed and undyed and mixed up together. And it makes us think about what particular uses wads of textiles might have had, perhaps as pillows. A more complex collection of textiles and other items congealed together is also found in the photographic record. In this case, we have a fairly coarse red piece of cloth, a piece of leather that looks like it could be the sole of a shoe, a ceramic stopper, part of a bowl, and what seems to be a metal implement, all resting on a grass mat. The circumstances of this collection would also possibly indicate the contents of a bag, but in this case, perhaps not a woman's bag, because there are no clearly distinguishable items associated with women's work or personal items, apart from the product of women's work, the red cloth. In terms of the dating of this congealed cloth material and this collection of different artifacts, of course, much depends on the context of the finds and the datable items. And in this case, we have a common bronze Bar Kokhba coin from the second year of the revolt, dated to the year 133 to 134. But was it found with these materials? Unfortunately, Allegro wrote in his Search of the Desert that he found the coin in the initial investigative sounding. But as I said, he conflated in the Search in the Desert that initial investigation with the actual official excavation of 1961 to 2 for the sake of telling a riveting narrative. The pictures themselves actually give us more information because we appear to be in one of the blue tents from that expedition. And if you look at the sequence of the photographs with a mind to the man's hand, maybe I can backspace, see the man's hand there in the series of photographs, you'll see a little cut on the top of his finger. That cut appears when he next picks up the coin and takes a photograph of that. In fact, in the archival note, it is stated that the coin is from Christmas Cave, Trench 3, 1A, 2.3 meters east of string AB, 10 centimeters south of CD in, quote, the first layer associated with cloth, ropes, etc., on a hard layer or floor of rubble or plaster. This is tremendously important information. because it shows that the coin was associated with these other objects of fabric and wooden objects and different items. In fact, this layer had a wealth of Roman pottery and glass, including a shaved Herodian lamp spout, wooden spoons and combs, as well as a wooden stamp seal. That there was a hard floor of rubble or plaster is actually extremely interesting for refugee archaeology. This is even identified in the notes as an occupation layer. There is also mention of a mud floor under plaster floor, which suggests quite a lot of preparation of this floor. This suggests that the refugees in this cave considered their stay in this location might be quite long. Rather than doing nothing much, they spent their time ensuring that there was a good floor. There was an attempt to make it more like home. There were even rugs or blankets suitable for spreading on such a floor, much like those found on the bodies in Nahal Hever. Elsewhere in the cave, there are clear items of women's wear, such as hairnets, bun supports, scarves, and mantles with the gamma shapes that are most likely associated with women. Some of these can be found in the IAA's National Treasure database online. Overall, the repertoire is very similar to what we have in the Cave of Letters, and it's asked us to think of the women's experience of living in this cave. In most ways, the most exciting collection of items, unfortunately that they're so exciting, and from a woman's bag, in fact, comes from the looted items, the very initial collection of artifacts the Bedouin took from the cave, as illustrated in Allegro's Search in the Desert. In the archives, there are many excellent close-up of pictures of the items in this cache. I have, I'm very short on time now, and I should be wrapping up. I've just got 1.5 more pages to read, and then I'm going to wrap up. I just want to make that note to Anthony and Tessa, who may be wondering when I'm going to stop. It is important then to think about the finding of this cave. It was the Bedouin who first of all found this cave, and what has happened to this purchased cache, in fact, is unclear to me. But it seems that they were bought by the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation itself, and they were gifted then to a museum where they have been given an accession number J11243, and I don't know whether that is in the Rockefeller or the Amman Museum. I haven't been able to actually see these items myself, and if anyone has any clues about where they are now, that would be great. But you will see here these different items that show that they are from a woman's bag and very much from the Bar Kokhba period. They include 9 spindle wools, 3 combs, coal sticks, a coal container, an earring, a wooden plate veritably identical to one found in Nahal Hever, a little blue bead, and a box with an inlaid bird pattern, which may or may not come from the Bar Kokhba period. I will be guided on by others on that one too. I would like to mention also that there were documents in this cave too, but in this case we have only the tiniest little piece of one that remains. So here it is. I am grateful to JOAN and Orit Rosengarten for images and permission to publish it. These pieces are tiny and in poor condition and may well have deteriorated further after excavation from the long storage in the box in the Rockefeller before they were passed over finally for conservation in the Israel Museum. But we can see in this one one legible piece, the Greek letter P, pi, and perhaps an upsilon and lambda. This is not much to go on as a text, but it needs to be added to the textual collection of the caves. And kindly Hannah Cotton has agreed to help me with publication. In terms of archaeology, however, it is really important because it shows that in this cave too, the refugees brought documents, perhaps thinking of their value in the future, and they survived, thinking of their homes. There is every reason to expect in this cave too that most of the occupants are women and children. However, what we have is a much more disturbed cave environment than in Nahal Hever. perhaps because of the Bedouin digging, and perhaps because of further disturbances over the course of time, because this was a more accessible cave. Unlike in Nahal Hever, there was no Roman encampment right above the cave, and there is apparently no human skeletal material in the cave. I like to think, therefore, that perhaps some of the people of this cave actually escaped, though it may be that they were simply captured rather than dying of dehydration or starvation. They might have thought that here, out in this frighteningly inhospitable wilderness, they were in the middle of nowhere and could weather the storm. But that their personal possessions remained in the cave does not point to a happy conclusion for these refugees who had so carefully made the floor. The woman who kept her cosmetics with her in such a remote environment left them there in the end. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Joan. That was fantastic. And except for the sad ending, which is...
It's all very sad.
I know, but what else can one conclude? So I'm sure there'll be so many questions. I'm looking at the chat now, and I see that Anthony has come in first. Anthony, do you want to ask your question about the color purple?
Sure, Jane. Firstly, thank you very much indeed. How absolutely fascinating. One of the earlier slides showed some organic material which had a very strong purple color, which I assume, maybe incorrectly, was probably derived from murex. I don't know whether the spectroscopy has actually shown that to be so or not, but if it was derived from murex, what do you think that might tell us about the economic status of its owner, and indeed what might we gather about the other artifacts that lay around it?
But that is the whole subject of the study of dyes, and I don't know if Nama Sikonik is here with us today, but if she's here, she should be answering that question, not me. But I understood it's a copy. It's not the high quality of dye. It's not the best quality of dye. It's a copy, and there were all sorts of different ways of copying the really expensive colors, using indigo ways of getting that same color. So there's a whole question about whether or not it was used for zitzit, for the fringes on garments, and Yadin actually thought that this was somehow going to be used for those, which is very, very important. But there's a great discussion about dyes, so I sort of feel like if I launch into it, I'm going to not say what a dye expert would say, but just in terms of the social class of the people in the cave, I think in terms of what you've got in the first goat skin, we do have an indication that the person, the woman there, was reasonably well off. And elsewhere in the cave, there's beautiful glass vessels which indicate reasonably high social class. The documents themselves indicate land ownership. So we've got people who are reasonably well-to-do, but well-to-do in terms of a village environment, not well-to-do as in Rome. They're relatively well-to-do in terms of their artifacts.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, yes, we have a question from David Gurvich, asking about, but slightly tangentially, Ray John Allegro, about the Shapira scrolls. Actually, David, do you want to ask it? Sorry, I'd forgotten my normal practice. If you're there, you can unmute and...
Yes, thank you. So, Joan, first of all, thank you so much for your wonderful lecture. It was fascinating. And since you talked a lot about John Allegro, and I understand that you've seen his archive, I understand that in his archives, he has some materials regarding Shapiro affairs that were not published. And I was wondering, what's your position about the Shapiro scrolls? Where is there authentic? Maybe you have some information that you've seen in the archives and so on.
I think I should actually pass on that one. There's a lot in John Allegro's archives that I haven't explored. I've been very, very focused. In fact, Joan Allegro and Judith and her daughter Judith Brown have done a wonderful job in saving this very, very valuable material from his personal archives. But there's a lot of it in terms of all sorts of different subjects. And so I have to say, I've just really burrowed in and tried to find what I needed for, first of all, for studies of the Qumran caves, which I was undertaking prior to this particular project with Dennis Mitzi and Marcello Fidencio. And then this project, which is so much about the Christmas cave. Sorry, I can't comment.
Right, thank you so much.
And now, Larry Schiffman, hello. You may please go ahead and both ask and make a comment if that's too separate.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you, Joan, for this wonderful lecture. And allow me, if I make the comment and then ask the question. The comment is, it strikes me that regarding the daily life aspect and the objects pertaining to women that you brought together here, that there's a tremendous amount of information in Tanaitic literature, which is roughly contemporaneous, about the same stuff. And I think it would be worth taking a look there, even though people usually don't read it for this material. If you read it the right way, it's all over. And I think that would be helpful. Now, that was the comment. The question is, I assume this whole project is connected up with this project locating Qumran materials that are outside that you're involved in, or is this totally disconnected? And thank you. Lecture.
Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Wealth of material in terms of looking at rabbinics. What's really interesting is to actually match up the words with the objects. So we almost need an illustrated Mishnah, you know, from what we've got in the caves. We can actually say, now this is the object they're referring to here. This is the object, and I think there's just so much that one could do. I totally agree. I love that. Yes, we did the project funded by the Leverhulme Foundation on dispersed Qumran artifacts and archival sources. And then that's where I found the Allegro archive and thought, wow, this is just the most incredible resource. And as part of that, when I was looking at Qumran materials, and I found all of this material on the Christmas cave. And I thought, well, it's not a Qumran cave. I can't work on it as part of the DCAS project. So I just had to kind of hold my breath and hold it and not continue with that until I got further funding. So I got further funding from the Leverhulme to do this completely separate project. But it's really important to keep the Christmas cave separate from Qumran, because some of you will know the story of the storage in the Rockefeller is John Allegro and his team, the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, put the boxes in storage in the Palestine Archaeological Museum, the Rockefeller, and then the Six-Day War happened. Transfer or in terms of authority of the museum, they no longer wanted to work with they didn't want to work with the Israelis who had taken over the museum. They were very loyal to King Hussein, and so they just down tools and didn't continue to publish the material, and it was just on the shelves in the Rockefeller. And then in the 1980s, the École Biblique found these boxes and mistakenly thought they were from Qumran. And they integrated all of the Christmas cave materials into the Qumran materials that they had in the Rockefeller. And so at the moment, everything but the organic remains, actually including the bones. All of that material is still in the storage of the Rockefeller, all mixed up with Qumran. And Qumran archaeology, to get access to anything in terms of the Qumran archaeological record is extremely difficult. It's really the École Biblique's patch. So what I would really like is for someone to go through and take out all of the Christmas cave materials from the Qumran archaeology holdings and put them back somewhere else, so that researchers can properly work on them and look at them from, you know, the Bar Kokhba perspective or Chalcolithic perspective, but that's actually proving incredibly difficult. You know, I feel like I'm trying to solve, you know, Middle East peace, do the Middle East peace process just to extract the Christmas cave materials from the Qumran archaeology material in the Rockefeller. And yeah, it's very difficult.
They mixed up Christmas and Thanksgiving. That's right on the Thanksgiving story.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, I must say. David Jacobson has a linguistic question. David, are you unmuted? Unmute yourself. If you... No, you're still mute now.
There we go. Hi, Joan. Hi. It's good to see you at long last after a long time. You're looking well. Anyway, the question is, if I heard correctly, my hearing's not that good, that scrap of written material, which was it papyrus or leather? Or
papyrus.
Papyrus, yeah. That it had some Greek letters on it. If that's the case, it means that the occupants of the cave, those refugees, knew, at least one of them, knew Greek. And that does tell me that they were indeed quite well educated. Now, I know a lot of people in that period in Judea knew Greek, but still, they were certainly not peasants. The fact that documents, perhaps legal documents, in Greek. Would you like to comment on that?
Again, as with the dye question, Hannah Cotton is right here. Maybe she would like to comment on that.
Hannah has waved. Would you, Hannah, are you ready to say something?
No, I've finished. I'll unwave.
Yeah, no, but Hannah...
Oh, I just wanted to say that in my opinion, it does tell us that we are dealing with probably, fairly senior people in the society of the Bar Kokhba community.
Mm. Hannah, you are muted. Can we get her to unmute, Anthony?
No.
Oh dear.
Yep. You can as well.
Can I? Oh well.
Yeah, but I'm happy to do that.
Okay.
Yes.
I unmuted, I think.
Yep.
Okay, I wanted to say that the presence of Greek in the caves is always suspicious to me. It's, for example, no one would think that a Babatha who said, "Dia me eidenai grammata," because I don't know to read and write, that's what she used as scribe. So the presence of Greek points to scribes. It doesn't tell us very much about literacy. And we can say that about the archive of Salome, we can say that about Babatha, we can say also about some of the Bar Kokhba letters. In other words, it's not the case that people who are signed on documents actually wrote them. And so to know about literacy from that is very risky. Well, that's in fact all. Just a comment, having read most of these documents, at least in the Cave of Letters, literacy is problematic. And there are some studies, of course, about literacy at that period and as revealed in the documents and as well as in other findings, but we have to be careful.
Do you want to add anything, Joan?
No, that's spot on.
Right. Charlotta, you have a question or a comment?
Yes, thank you very much, Tessa, and thank you, Joan. I really enjoyed that. And I just wanted to say, I really appreciate your focus on the refugee context and actually on the time spent in the caves. And I really look forward to learning more about that. I think that's a really interesting angle. And the other thing that I wondered was the comments about wealthy people. It does seem to me as well, rather elite as well, to have such ornate items there, whether it's village or not. It seems people who had time, you know, to produce beautiful things and have beautiful things. I don't know whether to what extent the village just then means, you know, that it would still be someone with some leisure and some means. But I really particularly enjoyed that angle, and I look forward to reading more about that. And perhaps it's a wider research field in antiquity that I hadn't really come across yet. So thank you ever so much.
Oh, thank you, Charlotta. Yeah, I think we do really need to think about class, and I'm really glad to have these questions about it, how we situate people in terms of material artifacts reflecting class. But it's quite difficult to know, because one thing, when I lived in Africa, I was amazed at how people could live in quite poor conditions, but they would have some treasured items that were very nice. And especially for women, anything to do with looking good, you know, your collection of jewelry, your cosmetics, and actually your clothing, you know, actually spend quite a lot of money on having a new outfit for a special occasion, relative to actually the total household income. Taking pride in one's appearance was really quite crucial where I lived in the Gambia. I was very conscious of that. Whereas you might live in a place with a dirt floor, and you know that you would look fantastic. So how we imagine material comforts isn't necessarily how it maps onto other parts of the world. So but I do agree. I think that they were more, certainly within a village environment, they were more on the high side in terms of social class.
That's not even so very different in extremely poor areas in parts of Europe, where people are still dressing phenomenally well. May I just ask you a question, Joan, about possible comparisons? I mean, I'm wondering, the Masada people were refugees and for the long haul, some 50, 60 years earlier. A lot of the material objects probably didn't change much, or even possibly lifestyles. And we certainly have items of clothing. I think we have some artifacts in obvious ways related to women. Is there any useful comparison to be made in terms of gender archaeology?
That's really interesting, actually. That's a fascinating question. I haven't gone there in terms of my comparative look yet at Masada. But because Masada was an entire, well, little town, really, fortress, occupied by the rebels, it has a different profile to fleeing to a cave. It's a different sort of thing. And I suppose they were living normally in rooms there. They weren't sort of packing themselves up into bags and trying to, you know, there's no furniture in a cave. You live out of your bag. The concept of the bag to me is really important in terms of the cave. So, so somewhat different in terms of the template we've got for the two places, but other things that are interesting in terms of the survival of organic remains and parts of Masada. So I'll have to think about that. I think there's something that could be really useful in thinking about the similarities and differences of the Bar Kokhba caves and Masada from that earlier period. Thank you.
Right. Well, I'm seeing in the chat for the moment that we haven't got any further questions, and we're nearing the end of our usual allowance of time, certainly. And over here it's dinner time, perhaps in New Zealand breakfast time, I don't know.
Yes.
So I think without more ado, Joan, I want to thank you for a most fantastically interesting and extremely well-informed and stimulating lecture. Thank you. And
thank you.
whatever
Thanks for coming.
happens. So see you again soon, and bye everybody, and thanks for your questions and your participation.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.